You got 3 seconds to get off that bench, or I make you. The flashlight beam hit Jerome's face like a slap. 5:47 a.m. Founders Square Park. Millbrook, Tennessee. Fog crawling across the grass. Street lights still burning pale orange against the gray. Jerome didn't move, didn't flinch. Just looked up at the officer standing over him. 6'2", 220, hand already drifting toward his belt. The officer had picked the wrong homeless man to clear before sunrise. He just didn't know it yet. I said 3 seconds. The officer's boot nudged Jerome's blanket, folded into a perfect square beside the bench, corners at 45-degree angles. You deaf? I heard you. Jerome's voice came out flat, controlled, the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable when they expected fear. Park opens at 5 a.m. Sign says so, right there. He nodded toward the metal placard bolted to the lamppost. The officer didn't look. I don't care what the sign says. I'm telling you to move. On what grounds? The question hung in the cold air. Simple, direct. The kind of question that shouldn't need asking in a country with laws. But the officer's jaw tightened like Jerome had insulted his mother. Grounds? A short laugh. No humor in it. How about because I said so? How about because you smell like you haven't showered in a week? How about because decent people are going to walk through here in an hour and they don't need to see your kind? Your kind. Jerome absorbed the words the way he'd absorbed worse. Fallujah. Ramadi. The things men said when they thought they had power over you. When they thought you were nothing. He reached for the notebook beside his blanket. Navy blue cover, worn at the edges. The officer's hand shot out, grabbed his wrist. Don't. It's a notebook. I said don't move. The grip tightened. Bones grinding against bones. What's in your pockets, huh? What you got? Nothing. We'll see about that. Partner? A second officer emerged from the patrol car idling at the curb. Younger, maybe late 20s. Moving slower, watching the scene with something that might have been hesitation. Weathers, get over here. We got a resistant. Jerome hadn't resisted anything, but the word was already in the air, already becoming official, already writing a story that had nothing to do with truth. If you're watching this story unfold and want to see where it goes, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next is going to shock you. The younger officer, Weathers, approached with his hand on his taser. Standard positioning for a standard encounter. Except nothing about this was standard. Sir, we're going to need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands where we can see them. At least he said, sir. Jerome rose. Deliberate movements. No sudden gestures. He'd been trained to move around armed men. He'd been trained to understand that panic gets people killed. His body moved the way his body had always moved. Smooth, controlled. Each action telegraphed before execution. The first officer, Pemberton, according to his nameplate, noticed. His eyes narrowed. You military? I'm a citizen sitting in a public park during public hours. That's not what I asked. That's what I answered. Pemberton's face flushed. The flashlight beam wavered as his grip tightened. Behind him, the patrol car's radio crackled with dispatch chatter. Someone else's problem on the other side of town. ID now. Jerome reached into his jacket pocket. Slow. Visible. He produced a Tennessee identification card. Not a driver's license. He didn't have a car anymore. Didn't have much of anything anymore. Pemberton snatched it, examined it under the flashlight. Jerome Lattimore. This address, what is this, a P.O. box service? It's where I receive mail. So you're homeless. I'm between permanent addresses. You're homeless. Pemberton said it like a verdict, like a crime already proven. Weathers, run him. The younger officer retreated to the patrol car, ID in hand. Jerome stood perfectly still in the cold morning air, fog swirling around his ankles, while his identity got fed into a system that would tell them exactly what he was on paper. Which was nothing. No warrants, no criminal record, no outstanding fines, no reason to hold him for a single second longer than it took to confirm he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man sitting on a bench in a public park. But Pemberton's expression said that wouldn't matter. What were you writing in that notebook? Personal thoughts. Let me see it. No. The word dropped like a stone into still water. Pemberton's hand moved toward his belt again. Taser this time. Maybe something worse. You refusing to cooperate with a lawful order? Asking to see my personal writings isn't a lawful order. You have no warrant, no probable cause, and no articulable suspicion of any crime. The Fourth Amendment protects my property from unreasonable search. The words came out textbook precise. Too precise for a homeless man, too specific for someone who should have been scared and scrambling. Weathers returned from the patrol car. He's clean, nothing comes up. Nothing? No warrants, no priors, nothing. Pemberton's flashlight beam didn't waver. His grip on Jerome's ID didn't loosen. Something was happening behind his eyes, calculations being made, risks being weighed. Doesn't matter. He's trespassing. The park's open, Weathers said quietly. Sign says 5 a.m. It's after 5. The sign says no overnight sleeping. He was sleeping. I was sitting. Jerome's voice stayed level. My blanket is beside me, not under me. My eyes were open when you approached. I was writing in my notebook. None of that constitutes sleeping. You calling me a liar? I'm stating facts. Pemberton moved fast, one hand on Jerome's shoulder, spinning him around, the other hand grabbing his wrist, wrenching it behind his back. Pain shot up Jerome's arm, but he didn't cry out, didn't resist. Just let his body go loose the way he'd been taught, absorbing force instead of fighting it. You're under arrest. For what? Criminal trespass. I haven't committed any crime. Resisting arrest. I'm not resisting. The handcuffs clicked shut, cold metal biting into skin. Jerome stared at the lamppost in front of him, at the sign that clearly stated park hours, at the evidence of his innocence mounted in public view where anyone with eyes could see it. Not that anyone was looking. 5:51 a.m., Founders Square Park, a man arrested for sitting on a bench. Across the street, a figure stopped walking. Older black man in a heavy coat, Pastor Cornelius Wade, on his way to open the church for early morning preparation. He'd walked this route for 15 years. Had seen a lot of things in downtown Millbrook at odd hours. But something about this scene made him reach for his phone. He didn't announce himself, didn't interfere, just pressed record and watched through the screen as 2 officers loaded a handcuffed man into the back of a patrol car. The timestamp in the corner read 5:51 a.m. The video would run for 17 minutes before Wade finally lowered his phone. 17 minutes of documentation. 17 minutes of truth. 2 days earlier, the Millbrook Public Library opened at 9 a.m. sharp. Jerome arrived at 8:53. He'd learned that being early meant being first in line for the computers. Being first meant getting the terminal in the back corner, the one where the screen wasn't visible from the main desk, where he could check his email without someone looking over his shoulder. Privacy was luxury when you didn't have walls. The library was warm. That mattered more than people realized. November in Tennessee meant mornings cold enough to see your breath, nights cold enough to feel the ache in your joints. The library had heating. The library had bathrooms. The library had chairs that didn't belong to anyone, where you could sit for hours without buying anything. Mrs. Odom worked the front desk. 63 years old, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been the head librarian for 20 years. She knew every regular, every pattern, every face that came through those doors. She knew Jerome. "Good morning, Mr. Lattimore." He nodded, didn't smile. Smiling took energy he'd learned to conserve, but acknowledged her with the respect she'd always shown him. "Morning, Mrs. Odom. Computer 3 is available. I saved it for you." She wasn't supposed to do that. Library policy said computers were first come, first served. But Mrs. Odom had her own policies, developed over decades of watching people who needed help and people who needed watching. Jerome fell into the first category. She'd known that from the first week he showed up, back in March. The way he entered a room, scanning corners, cataloging exits. The way he sat, back to the wall, eyes on the door. The way he folded his jacket before sitting, precise as origami, not a wrinkle out of place. She'd seen veterans before. Her husband had been one. Dead now, 15 years. But she remembered the way he moved, the way he watched, the way he never really stopped being alert, even in his own living room. Jerome moved the same way. "Thank you." He walked to computer 3, sat down, positioned the chair so he could see the entrance in his peripheral vision. The VA website loaded slowly. Government servers. Underfunded. Overworked. Like everything else the government ran for people it promised to serve. He logged into his account. 3 new messages. The first was automated. "Your claim is under review. Estimated processing time, 60 to 90 days. He'd received this same message 9 times in 16 months. The second was from a caseworker named Rodriguez. "Mr. Lattimore, I've flagged your file for expedited review. Unfortunately, the expedited queue is currently experiencing a 6-week backlog. I apologize for any inconvenience." Inconvenience. Like losing your apartment was an inconvenience. Like sleeping in shelters and parks and the occasional church basement was an inconvenience. Like watching your life dissolve while bureaucrats shuffled papers was just a minor scheduling problem. The third message was different, flagged urgent, from the regional office in Memphis. "Your benefits claim has been placed on administrative hold pending additional documentation. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss required materials." Administrative hold. Jerome stared at those words for a long time. He'd submitted every document they'd asked for. DD-214, medical records, proof of service-connected disability, letters from his commanding officer, letters from the neurologist who diagnosed his traumatic brain injury, letters from the VA's own doctors confirming the diagnosis. He'd done everything right, followed every instruction, met every deadline. And now, 16 months later, his claim was on hold. Again. For additional documentation that no one would specify, that no one would explain, that existed only as another obstacle in an endless obstacle course designed to exhaust people into giving up. He opened his notebook. Navy blue cover, worn at the edges. Inside, pages filled with dates and times and names and reference numbers. Every call to the VA, every email, every letter, every promise made and broken. A paper trail of bureaucratic failure that would mean nothing to anyone except him. He added today's date, wrote down the caseworker's name, Rodriguez, wrote down the new status. Administrative hold. His handwriting was precise. Block letters, each one exactly the same height as the one before. The kind of penmanship they drilled into you in boot camp when you had to label equipment that other lives depended on. Mrs. Odom glanced over from her desk, watched him write, watched the way his pen moved, controlled, deliberate, mechanical, like a man following a procedure even when the procedure had failed him. She looked away before he noticed. Some things weren't her business to observe. Jerome finished his notes and checked the clock. 9:47 a.m. He had until noon before the lunch rush filled the library with students and job seekers competing for terminals. Until then, he could research, could look up the statute they'd cited. Tennessee Code Section 39, 14-405, criminal trespass. Could learn what it actually said versus what police claimed it said. Knowledge was armor. He'd learned that a long time ago. When you couldn't control what happened to you, you could at least understand it. The statute was straightforward. 3 elements required for criminal trespass. Entry onto property. Notice that entry was forbidden. Refusal to depart after notice. 3 elements. All 3 required. Not 1, not 2. All 3. A sign saying no overnight sleeping wasn't notice that daytime entry was forbidden, Being told to leave after arriving during legal hours wasn't the same as being warned before entry, and he hadn't refused anything, hadn't been given the chance to refuse, because they'd cuffed him before asking him to leave. The arrest that was coming, and he could feel it coming, the way you feel weather changing, would be illegal. But illegal and unpunished were different things. He knew that too. At 11:30, a security guard walked through the library. Not a regular, not someone Jerome had seen before. Young, maybe 25, with the overeager posture of someone who'd watched too many cop shows. The guard walked past the study tables, past the magazine racks, past the children's section, and stopped at the row of computers in the back corner. Stopped at Jerome's terminal. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the computer." Jerome saved his research notes, closed the browser. "Is there a problem?" "We've received a complaint about your presence." "A complaint about me using a public library computer?" "A complaint about you occupying space that should be available for legitimate patrons." Legitimate patrons. The words hung in the air between them. "I'm a library card holder." Jerome reached for his wallet, slow and visible. "I've been coming here for 8 months. Never had a problem." "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." "No." The guard blinked. He'd expected compliance. Expected the homeless man to shuffle away quietly, the way homeless people were supposed to shuffle away when told. That was how the script went. Jerome wasn't following the script. "I'm not leaving until I've finished what I came here to do. If you have a specific policy I'm violating, cite it. If someone has filed a formal complaint, I'll need that in writing. Until then, I'm a patron using library services during library hours, which is my legal right." The guard's hand moved toward his radio. "I'm going to call the police." "That's your choice, but I'd recommend checking with Mrs. Odom first. She's worked here 20 years. She knows me." Something in Jerome's voice, not threatening but certain, made the guard pause. He glanced toward the front desk where Mrs. Odom had stopped checking in books and was watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Is there a problem, Kevin?" Her voice carried clearly across the quiet library. "This gentleman is refusing to leave. Mr. Lattimore is one of our regulars. He has a valid library card and hasn't violated any policies." Mrs. Odom walked toward them, silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "Who filed the complaint?" Kevin shifted his weight. It was anonymous. Anonymous complaints don't justify removing a patron who's following the rules. "Mr. Lattimore, you're welcome to continue using the computers." She said it simply, directly. Like it wasn't an act of minor heroism. Like standing up for someone nobody else would defend was just part of her job description. Kevin retreated toward the entrance, muttering into his radio. Jerome watched him go, then looked at Mrs. Odom. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing." She paused. "And maybe avoid computer 3 tomorrow, just in case." She walked back to her desk. Jerome turned back to his screen, but something had shifted in the air. A reminder that not everyone looked at him and saw nothing. That some people still saw a human being. It was a small thing. In the grand scope of what he'd lost, it barely registered. But it was something. The soup kitchen at First Baptist Church opened at 5 p.m. Pastor Cornelius Wade had been running it for 15 years. Before that, he'd spent 20 years as a trucker. Before that, he'd spent 3 years in Vietnam watching friends die in jungles that meant nothing to anyone except the people dying in them. He understood what it meant to come home from a war and find that home had moved on without you. That the country you fought for wasn't sure it wanted you back. The basement of First Baptist could hold 40 people. Most nights it served 30, chicken and rice, vegetable soup, bread that the bakery on Main Street donated when it started going stale. Nothing fancy, but hot, and enough. Jerome arrived at 5:07 p.m., early, but not first. A couple of regulars had already claimed tables near the serving line, the prime real estate of the free meal economy. He took a table in the corner. Back to the wall. Clear sightline to the door. Pastor Wade noticed. He always noticed. "Mr. Lattimore." The pastor stopped beside the table, wiping his hands on a towel. 68 years old, gray beard going white, eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. Chicken tonight. You want white meat or dark? Whatever's available. That's not what I asked. Jerome looked up. Most people talked past him, talked around him, asked questions they didn't want answered, but Wade asked questions and waited. Dark, Jerome said finally. If it's available. Wade nodded and walked toward the kitchen, came back 5 minutes later with a plate piled high, more than the standard serving, though neither of them mentioned it. You eat like mess halls, Wade said, watching Jerome cut his chicken into precise, equal portions. Just hungry, Pastor. Mm-hmm. Wade didn't push, didn't pry, just stood there with the quiet presence of a man who'd learned that silence often worked better than questions. You sleeping okay? Well enough. The shelter on 4th Street has beds. I could make a call. I appreciate that, but I'm managing. Right now, thousands of people are watching this story, but only a fraction have subscribed. If you're one of them, take a second and hit that button. You won't want to miss what's coming. Wade pulled out a chair, sat down across from Jerome, which he didn't usually do. Usually he circulated, making sure everyone got served, making sure no fights broke out, making sure the dignity of the meal wasn't disrupted by the desperation that sometimes surfaced when people had nothing. I've been running this kitchen a long time, Wade said. I've seen a lot of people come through. Some of them climb back up, some of them don't. You want to know the difference? Jerome kept eating. Didn't answer. The ones who climb back up, they ask for help before they fall all the way down. The ones who don't, they think asking for help is admitting defeat. They think they have to handle everything alone. Wade leaned forward. You remind me of the second kind. With respect, Pastor, you don't know me. No, I don't. No. But I know what carrying weight looks like. I know what it does to a man when he thinks he's got to carry it alone. Jerome set down his fork. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Not vulnerability exactly, but the acknowledgement that Wade was seeing something real. I made it through worse, Jerome said. I'll make it through this. I don't doubt that. But making it through and living, those aren't always the same thing. The kitchen sounds filled the silence between them. Silverware on plates. Quiet conversations. Someone laughing at a table near the window. Surprising how often people laughed here, how resilient joy could be even in the worst circumstances. There's a man comes in sometimes, Wade said. Works for the VA. Not officially. Volunteers on weekends. Helps people with their paperwork. You might want to talk to him. I've talked to the VA. Not the same thing. This man actually listens. Jerome picked up his fork again. I'll think about it. Wade stood up. That's all I ask. He walked back toward the serving line, where a new wave of hungry people was starting to arrive. Jerome finished his meal in silence, washing down the last of the chicken with water from a paper cup. He stayed until 6:30, long enough for the crowd to thin, long enough for the volunteers to start cleaning up. Then he thanked Wade, carried his tray to the wash station, and walked out into the November evening. It would be dark in an hour. He needed to find somewhere to sleep. The park was always quieter after sunset. Founders Square sat in the heart of downtown Millbrook, 3 acres of grass and trees and benches surrounded by brick buildings that had been banks and hotels 100 years ago. During the day, it filled with lunch crowds and joggers and mothers pushing strollers. At night, it belonged to nobody. Or to everybody, depending on how you looked at it. Jerome arrived at 9:47 p.m., early enough to claim a bench before other sleepers arrived, late enough that the evening dog walkers had gone home. He chose the bench near the eastern entrance. Good sight lines, close to the street, which meant close to noise, but noise could be useful. You heard threats before they reached you. The temperature had dropped since dinner. 43 degrees, according to the digital clock on the bank across the street. Cold enough to need layers. Not cold enough to kill. Not yet. He spread his blanket on the ground first, then lay on top of it using his jacket as a pillow, notebook tucked inside the jacket where it pressed against his chest. The position looked uncomfortable because it was, but comfort wasn't the point. The point was keeping your possessions close. The point was being able to move quickly if you needed to. At 10:17 p.m., a patrol car rolled through the park. Jerome watched it through half-closed eyes. The car moved slowly, headlights sweeping across the grass, spotlighting benches one by one, looking for something, or someone. It stopped near the fountain. 30 seconds. A minute. Then started moving again, circling the perimeter. The driver's face was visible when the car passed under a streetlight. Pemberton. Jerome memorized the time, memorized the car number, memorized the direction the car went when it finally exited the park. Old habits. The kind you didn't unlearn even when you weren't getting paid to notice things anymore. The car came back at 11:43 p.m. Same driver, same slow circuit. This time it stopped near Jerome's bench, 50 feet away, close enough to see him clearly. Jerome didn't move, kept his breathing steady. Watched through his eyelashes as the car idled, as Pemberton's silhouette turned to look at him. 15 seconds, 20, 30, then the car pulled away. Jerome didn't sleep that night, not really. Dozed in fragments, waking at every sound, alert to every shift in the shadows around him. The training never really left you. Your body stayed ready even when your mind told it to rest. At 4:38 a.m., he gave up on sleep and sat up on the bench. The sky was starting to lighten in the east. The temperature had dropped to 36 degrees overnight. His joints ached from the cold, from the hard surface, from the tension of sleeping in public. He folded his blanket. Perfect square. Corners at 45 degrees, the way he'd been taught to fold blankets 30 years ago, when precision meant discipline and discipline meant survival. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. The day, the patrol car, the times, the way Pemberton had looked at him. The feeling, not paranoia but pattern recognition, that something was building, that he'd been noticed, that being noticed in this town by these people was dangerous. He was still writing when the sun came up, still writing when the flashlight hit his face. You got 3 seconds to get off that bench, or I make you. The arrest took 12 minutes. 12 minutes from Pemberton's first words to Jerome sitting in the back of a patrol car, hands cuffed behind his back, watching Founders Square disappear through tinted windows. 12 minutes for a man's freedom to evaporate. The patrol car smelled like fast food and sweat and something chemical, air freshener trying to cover up what air freshener never really covered. Jerome sat still, hands numb from the cuffs, mind cataloging details the way his mind had always cataloged details. Pemberton drove. Weathers rode shotgun. Neither of them spoke to Jerome. They spoke to each other like he wasn't there. Shepard's gonna love this, Pemberton said. Another one off the streets before the festival. You think he's really clean? Weathers asked. No record at all? Doesn't matter. He was trespassing. The park was open. He was sleeping. He was sitting. Pemberton's hands tightened on the steering wheel. You questioning me, rookie? Weathers went quiet. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his teeth. Jerome filed that away too. Weathers wasn't convinced. Weathers might be useful, or Weathers might be nothing. Time would tell. The precinct was a gray concrete box on the edge of downtown, 3 stories, bulletproof glass in the lobby, American flag hanging limp by the front door, no wind to move it. They brought Jerome in through the back. Sally Port, metal doors closing behind the patrol car before the doors ahead opened. A cage within a cage. Inside, the building smelled like floor wax and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in pale institutional glow. A few officers moved through the hallways, barely glancing at the new arrival. Just another body being processed. Just another number. The booking desk sat in the center of a large room lined with holding cells. A sergeant looked up when they entered, 50-ish, Hispanic, features arranged in professional neutrality. "What do we have?" "Criminal trespass," Pemberton said. "Founders Square." The sergeant's eyes flicked to Jerome, took in the worn jacket, the folded blanket still tucked under his arm, the calm expression that didn't match the situation. "He give you trouble?" "Resistant. Had to use force to subdue." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly, looked at Jerome again. No visible injuries, no torn clothing, no signs of any struggle. "Process him. Cell 4. The fingerprinting took 7 minutes. The photograph took 2. They inventoried his possessions: wallet, notebook, $12 in cash, a pen, a library card, and sealed them in a manila envelope. The notebook didn't go easily. "What's in here?" The processing officer flipped through pages. "Dates, times, notes. What is this?" "Personal journal," Jerome said. "You documenting something?" "I'm documenting my life." The officer looked at him for a long moment. Something in Jerome's eyes made him uncomfortable. Not threatening, but aware. Like Jerome was studying him the way he studied Jerome. The notebook went into the envelope. The envelope went into a locker. The key went on a hook behind the processing desk. Cell 4 was 8 feet by 6 feet. Concrete walls, metal toilet in the corner. Bench bolted to the wall. One other occupant, a white man in his 40s, sleeping off a drunk and disorderly, snoring like a broken generator. Jerome sat on the bench, back against the wall, eyes on the door. The cell door closed with a sound he'd heard before. Metal on metal. The sound of freedom ending. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't the one with the key. The first 6 hours passed slowly. Jerome didn't sleep, didn't pace. Just sat on the metal bench and watched the cell block through the small window in the door. Officers came and went. Other prisoners were processed. A domestic violence suspect, a DUI, 2 guys who'd been fighting outside a bar. Nobody talked to him. Nobody checked on him. Nobody asked if he needed water or food or a phone call. He hadn't asked for a phone call yet. That was deliberate. Timing mattered. Too early, and they'd process his request through normal channels. Delay it, lose the paperwork. Too late, and the window would close. At 11:47 a.m., a different officer approached his cell. Young, black, fit. Name tag read, Quinlan. He carried a clipboard and a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Lattimore, I'm Officer Quinlan. How are you holding up?" Jerome didn't answer. "I know this situation isn't ideal. Pemberton can be intense." Quinlan's voice dropped, conspiratorial. "Between us, I think there might have been some miscommunication. You want to tell me your side?" Good cop. Jerome recognized the routine. Different packaging, same product. "I want my phone call." "Of course. I'll see what I can do about that. But first, anything you want to get off your chest? Sometimes it helps to talk." "My phone call." Quinlan's smile flickered. "Right. I'll check on that." He walked away. Jerome watched him go to the sergeant's desk, watched them exchange words, watched Quinlan glance back toward cell 4 with an expression that had nothing friendly in it anymore. The phone call didn't come at noon. Didn't come at 1 p.m., didn't come at 2. At 2:23 p.m., Jerome stood up and walked to his cell door. "I'm requesting my statutory phone call under Tennessee Code of Criminal Procedure, Section 40-7-106. The officer at the nearest desk, not Quinlan, someone older, looked up with an expression of practiced annoyance. "System's down." "Then use a different system." "Not my department." "Whose department is it?" "Look, buddy, you'll get your call when you get your call. Sit tight." Jerome didn't sit tight. He stood at the door, visible, present, a reminder that he existed, that he had rights, that ignoring him required active effort. At 3:15 p.m., a woman appeared in the cell block. 50-ish, white, silver hair pulled back tight, captain's bars on her collar, She walked like someone who owned the building and expected everyone else to remember it. She stopped in front of cell 4. "You're the one making noise about phone calls." "I'm the one requesting my legal rights." "Legal rights." She said it like the words tasted sour. "You know what I see when I look at you? I see a vagrant who got caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. I see a drain on resources we don't have. I see a problem that my officers have to deal with because people like you can't get your lives together. People like me. Homeless people, drifters, whatever you want to call yourselves." She leaned closer to the cell door. "You want to know what happens to people who make noise in my precinct? They wait longer. They get processed slower. They find out that the system has a lot of flexibility when it comes to people nobody's looking for." Jerome met her gaze, didn't blink, didn't look away. "You might be surprised who's looking for me." Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty. She covered it fast, but not fast enough. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement." She stared at him for another moment, then turned and walked away, heels clicking on concrete. Jerome sat back down on the bench. Captain Shepard. He filed the name away with all the others. The phone call came at 6:34 p.m., 12 hours and 47 minutes after his arrest. 12 hours and 47 minutes of sitting in a cell for a crime that hadn't happened. They brought him to a hallway phone. Desk Sergeant Hightower stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, watching. 2 minutes. Jerome picked up the receiver, dialed a number from memory. 11 digits he'd committed to heart years ago, when committing things to heart meant the difference between rescue and death. The line rang once, twice. "Hello?" Male voice. Careful, alert. "Darius, listen, don't react." Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that meant understanding. "Contact NCIS Legal. Tell them Kilo 9 Bravo is in custody. Millbrook, Tennessee, Founders Square Precinct." "Copy." No questions, no panic, just acknowledgement. 48 hours. Affirmative, 48 hours. The line went quiet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Brothers who hadn't seen each other in 2 years. Brothers who communicated in brevity codes because brevity codes meant survival. "Jerome, out." He hung up. Desk Sergeant Hightower was staring at him. Something had shifted in her expression. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by something more like attention. "Military?" she asked. "Citizen." He handed her the receiver. "I'm done." They walked him back to his cell. The door closed behind him. Metal on metal. The same sound as before. But something had changed. Somewhere in Coronado, California, a Navy SEAL commander was reaching for his phone, making calls, activating networks, setting wheels in motion that these small-town police officers couldn't imagine. 48 hours. Jerome sat on the bench, closed his eyes, and waited for the cavalry to arrive. At 9:17 p.m., Officer Quinlan returned. "Mr. Lattimore." His voice had changed, less friendly, more wary. "Captain Shepard wants to see you." "Why?" She didn't say. "Come with me." They moved through the precinct hallways. Quinlan in front, Jerome behind, hands still cuffed even though he hadn't been charged with any violent crime. "Standard procedure," Quinlan explained, "for everyone's safety," whose safety was an open question. Shepard's office was on the second floor. Glass windows overlooking the cell block. Plaques and certificates covering the walls. 30 years of service commemorated in frames that nobody probably looked at anymore. She sat behind her desk. Jerome stood in front of it. Quinlan stayed by the door. "Sit down." Jerome sat. The chair was hard plastic, uncomfortable by design. "I've been looking at your file," Shepard said. "Tennessee ID, no criminal record, no permanent address, no employment history for the past 2 years. She looked up. "Who are you?" "Jerome Lattimore." "I know your name. I'm asking who you are. Because homeless men don't usually cite statute numbers from memory. They don't usually know their rights better than my officers. And they don't usually make phone calls using military code words. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. There was no privacy in a precinct, only the illusion of it. I'm a citizen exercising my constitutional rights. You're a vagrant trespassing on public property. I was sitting in a public park during public hours. That's not trespassing under Tennessee law. You know it. I know it. The question is whether you're willing to break the law to keep me here anyway. Shepard's eyes hardened. You think you're smart. I think I know when I'm being railroaded. Railroaded, she laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Let me tell you something about how this town works. We have a festival coming up. Biggest weekend of the year. Tourists coming from all over. Spending money in our shops, eating in our restaurants, filling up our hotels. And you know what tourists don't want to see? People like you, sleeping on benches, begging for change, making the downtown look like a homeless camp. So you arrest people for being visible. I maintain public order. By violating civil rights. Shepard stood up, walked around her desk. Stopped close enough that Jerome could smell her perfume. Something floral, expensive, inappropriate for a police captain. You want to know what happens to people who cause problems for me? They disappear into the system. Charges get lost. Paperwork gets misfiled. Bail hearings get delayed. By the time anyone notices, the festival's over and nobody cares anymore. She leaned closer. Is that what you want? Jerome didn't lean back, didn't break eye contact. What I want is to be released, since you have no legal basis to hold me. What I want is for your officers to stop arresting people for crimes they didn't commit. What I want is for you to understand that your actions have consequences you can't see yet. Consequences. She almost smiled. What consequences could a homeless man possibly bring? The kind you won't see coming until they're already here. Something flickered across her face, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of doubt. She straightened up, smoothed her uniform. Take him back to his cell. The night passed. Jerome sat in the dark, listening to the precinct settle around him. The drunk in the next cell had been released. A new occupant arrived around midnight. Domestic assault, from the fragments of conversation Jerome overheard. Crying when they brought him in, silent now. At 2:14 a.m., footsteps approached. Not the measured tread of officers making rounds. Something different, heavier, more deliberate. The cell door opened. Pemberton stepped inside. He was alone, no partner, no witnesses. The hallway behind him was empty, the lights dimmed for the overnight shift. Perfect conditions for conversations that never officially happened. Hey there, trespasser. Pemberton's smile was ugly, predatory. Heard you've been making trouble, citing laws, making my captain nervous. That's not very grateful, considering the hospitality we've shown you. Jerome stayed seated on the bench, hands visible, posture relaxed, showing nothing that could justify escalation. Hospitality. That's right. Roof over your head, warm place to sleep. More than you deserve. Pemberton stepped closer. You know what I think? I think you're not just some random homeless guy. I think you're something else. And I want to know what. I'm a citizen you arrested without cause. See, that's what I'm talking about. Regular homeless people don't talk like that. They don't make phone calls using military code. They don't make captains nervous. Pemberton's hand shot out, grabbed Jerome's collar, yanked him to his feet. So what are you? Undercover? Fed? Some kind of spy? Jerome's body absorbed the pull. Didn't resist. Didn't fight. Just moved with the force like water around stone. I'm a veteran who fell through the system. That's all. That's all? Pemberton's face was inches away. Breath hot, smelling like coffee and something sour. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know when someone's playing games with me? His fist came fast, caught Jerome in the stomach. Air exploded out of his lungs. He doubled over but didn't fall, didn't go down, stayed on his feet through force of will and years of training. "That's for making me look bad in front of Weathers." Pemberton grabbed his collar again, hauled him upright. "And this—" The second punch came for his face. Jerome moved. Not much, just enough. His head turned, and the fist grazed his cheek instead of breaking his nose. And then something happened. Pemberton's momentum carried him forward. Jerome shifted his weight, redirected, flowed. And suddenly Pemberton was stumbling, off balance, grabbing the cell bars to keep from falling. Jerome hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't grabbed anything, had simply moved the way water moves when you try to hit it, absorbing, redirecting, surviving. Pemberton's face flushed with humiliation. His hand went to his belt. Taser, maybe, or something worse. "I don't want trouble." Jerome's voice was calm, steady, like he hadn't just been assaulted by an officer who could write any story he wanted in his report. "But I won't be assaulted without defending myself." "You call that defense?" Pemberton's hand hovered over his weapon. "I call that resisting. There's a camera in this hallway. It may or may not be working, but do you really want to find out?" Pemberton looked up. The camera in the corner, mounted near the ceiling, its red light dark. Off, probably, like so many institutional safeguards when they became inconvenient. But probably wasn't certainly. He backed toward the door, his face twisted with frustrated rage. The need to punish, to dominate, warring with the survival instinct that told him this wasn't the time. This isn't over. It never is. Pemberton left. The cell door slammed shut. The footsteps retreated down the hallway. Jerome sat back down on the bench. His stomach ached where the punch had landed. His cheek throbbed where the second punch had grazed. Nothing serious, nothing permanent, just another inventory item in the catalog of indignities. He closed his eyes. 36 hours left. Morning came without breakfast. Jerome waited until 9 a.m. before asking, received no response, asked again at 10, was told the kitchen was backed up, asked a third time at 11. "You want breakfast? You should have behaved yourself." The desk officer didn't look up from his paperwork. "Word is you got physical with Pemberton last night. Pemberton entered my cell and assaulted me." "That's not what the report says." "There's a report?" "There's always a report." The officer finally looked up. "Says you resisted lawful commands. Says Pemberton had to use minimal force to subdue you. Says you threatened to sue the department." He smiled. "Threatening to sue isn't very smart when you're locked up in our building." Jerome said nothing. There was nothing to say. The narrative had been written. The story had been told. His version would never make it into any official record, but he wasn't counting on official records. At 1:47 p.m., Officer Quinlan appeared again. "Captain wants to see you again." "Why?" "She got a phone call. FBI." Quinlan's voice had changed. Nervous now. Uncertain. "Someone's asking about you." "Chai." The walk to Shepard's office felt different this time. Officers who had ignored Jerome before now watched him pass. Conversations stopped when he approached, resumed in whispers after he'd gone. Something had shifted in the precinct's atmosphere. Information was flowing that Jerome couldn't see, affecting calculations he wasn't part of. Shepard sat behind her desk again, but she wasn't alone. A younger woman stood by the window. Professional suit, professional posture, professional attention that took in Jerome with one sweep and saw things most people missed. "Mr. Lattimore." Shepard's voice was different, controlled. The arrogance from last night was muted, hidden behind careful neutrality. "This is Supervisory Special Agent Rowan, FBI Civil Rights Division." FBI. Jerome kept his expression neutral, but inside, something unclenched. The cavalry was ahead of schedule. "Mr. Lattimore?" Rowan's voice was crisp, direct. "I've been reviewing your case file. Would you like to tell me what happened 2 nights ago? We're about to blow this whole thing wide open. But before we do, make sure you're subscribed, because the reveal coming next is going to change everything you thought you knew about this story." Jerome looked at Shepard, then at Rowan. The captain's face was a mask, but underneath it, anxiety, fear, the understanding that something had gone wrong, that the vagrant she'd dismissed as nobody had turned out to be something else entirely. "I was arrested without cause," Jerome said. "Held for over 40 hours. Denied food this morning. Assaulted by Officer Pemberton last night in my cell. And I've been told the report says I was the one who resisted." Rowan didn't blink. "Do you have any injuries?" "Bruising on my stomach and face. I can show you." "That won't be necessary right now." She turned to Shepard. "Captain, I'm going to need all documentation related to Mr. Lattimore's arrest. Booking records, incident reports, any body camera footage, everything." "Of course." Shepard's voice was smooth, professional. "We'll have that compiled within the hour. I'll also need access to Officer Pemberton and Officer Weathers for interviews. I'll make them available." "Good." Rowan looked back at Jerome. "Mr. Lattimore, you're going to be released within the next 2 hours. Don't leave town. We'll need to speak with you further." Released. The word hung in the air like sunrise. "What about the charges?" "What charges?" Rowan's expression didn't change, but something in her tone suggested she knew exactly how thin those charges were. "The district attorney's office has declined to prosecute. Apparently, there's some question about whether the arrest was legally justified." Shepard's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. There was nothing she could say. "Thank you," Jerome said. "Don't thank me yet." Rowan's eyes held his. "This isn't over, not by a long way. But for now, you're free to go." The release process took 1 hour and 47 minutes. They returned his possessions, wallet, cash, library card, pen, and the notebook. Jerome opened it, flipped through the pages. Everything was there. Every date, every time, every name, every interaction he'd documented over months of surveillance, months of watching a system that was supposed to protect people like him instead victimize them. "You write a lot." The processing officer watched him check the pages. "What's all that?" "My life." "Hell of a journal." Jerome closed the notebook, tucked it inside his jacket, felt its weight against his chest. Evidence, memory, proof that what happened to him had happened. He walked out of the precinct at 4:23 p.m., 2 days and 1 hour after being arrested for sitting on a park bench. The sun was setting. Orange light spilling across downtown Millbrook, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The festival banners hung from lampposts, cheerful and bright, promising celebration and commerce. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed free air. Behind him, inside the gray concrete building, phones were ringing. Captain Shepard was meeting with union lawyers. Officer Pemberton was being called in for routine questions. The machinery of accountability was starting to turn, slowly, creakingly, the way it always turned when someone finally paid attention. But Jerome knew better than to think this was over. Shepard was still captain. Pemberton was still on the force. The system that had created them, that had rewarded them, protected them, enabled them, was still intact. One arrest, one investigation, one phone call from a SEAL commander wasn't going to change that. But it was a start. He walked toward the park. Founders Square. The scene of the crime that wasn't a crime. Pastor Wade was waiting by the fountain. "Saw you on the news," Wade said. "FBI showed up." "That's not nothing." "It's not everything either." "Never is." Wade fell into step beside him. "You got somewhere to stay tonight? My church has a room. Not much, but it's warm. Private. Nobody bothering you." Jerome considered. The bench was still there. The park was still public. But some battles were worth fighting from a position of strength. "I'd appreciate that, Pastor." They walked together through the gathering darkness. 2 veterans, 2 survivors, 2 men who understood that justice wasn't something handed down from on high. It was something you built, brick by brick, with your own bloody hands. Behind them, the precinct lights glowed against the twilight sky. Inside, evidence was being compiled. Statements were being taken. Stories were being coordinated by people who thought they still controlled the narrative. They were wrong. Jerome had a notebook full of truth. He had an FBI agent asking questions. He had a brother with connections that reached all the way to the Department of Defense. And he had 48 hours before everything changed. The first 48 were done. The next 48 were just beginning. Yayo. That night, Jerome slept in a real bed for the first time in 11 months. The room Pastor Wade provided was small, 10 by 12, single bed with clean sheets, window overlooking the church parking lot, bathroom down the hall, shared with the other overnight guests, a family of 3 escaping a bad situation, 2 men in recovery programs, and an elderly woman whose house had burned down last month. Not luxury, but safety. Jerome lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. His body ached. His mind wouldn't quiet. The events of the past 2 days played on loop. Pemberton's flashlight, the handcuffs, the cell, the fist connecting with his stomach. The phone call. Darius, his younger brother. 40 years old now. Commander of a SEAL team. A man who had followed Jerome into the military, then surpassed him, then kept climbing while Jerome had stumbled and fallen. They hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not because of anger, not because of distance, because Jerome hadn't wanted to be a burden. Hadn't wanted to call from shelters or park benches and admit that the big brother who'd taught him to fight, to survive, to never give up, had given up after all. But the call had to be made. Because Darius was the only one who could make things happen fast enough to matter. 48 hours. That was the timeline they'd established years ago, during joint training exercises, during deployments, during moments when communication windows were narrow and every word had to count. 48 hours was how long you could hold out before assuming the worst. 48 hours was how long it took to mobilize resources, cut through red tape, make things happen. The clock was ticking. Jerome closed his eyes and tried to sleep. At 6:17 a.m., his phone buzzed. Not his phone. The prepaid cell Pastor Wade had provided, loaded with enough minutes for emergencies. The number that appeared was unfamiliar, but the area code was Coronado. Jerome answered. "It's me." Darius's voice, controlled, professional, the voice of a commander used to giving orders, not asking questions. "I'm out." "I know. Rowan briefed me." "She's FBI. She's been investigating Millbrook for 14 months. You're case 51. There are 50 others just like you, and that's just the ones they've documented." Darius paused. "Brother, what the hell happened to you? 2 years without a word, and then a brevity code call from a Tennessee jail?" "It's complicated." "Uncomplicate it." Jerome sat up on the bed. The morning light was pale through the window, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. "I got hurt. TBI. You knew that." "I knew you got discharged. I didn't know you ended up on the streets." "The VA happened. 16 months of bureaucracy. Lost my apartment. Lost everything." Jerome ran a hand over his face. "I didn't want to call. Didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what? Like family?" Darius's voice sharpened. "Jerome, I've seen men die. I've seen men break. I've seen things that would make most people never sleep again. You think calling your brother from a bad spot is going to change how I see you?" Jerome didn't answer. "Listen to me." Darius's voice softened, just slightly. "The investigation is moving. DOD Inspector General is involved now. Someone flagged your VA file as hold 4 months after you submitted it. We're tracing who gave that order. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about a pattern. A system designed to make veterans disappear, and someone in that system is going to answer for it. What about Shepard? Pemberton? FBI has jurisdiction on the civil rights angle. Administrative proceedings are already starting. But Jerome, these things take time, months, maybe years. The system protects itself." "I know." "Do you?" Darius's voice hardened again. "Because the Jerome I remember wouldn't sit around waiting for the system to fix itself. The Jerome I remember would be building a case, gathering evidence, making sure that when the hammer finally fell, it fell hard enough to matter. Jerome looked at his notebook. Navy blue cover, worn at the edges, pages filled with dates and names and times. I've been building that case for 11 months. Then let's finish it. The administrative hearing was scheduled for 3 months out. 3 months of investigation. 3 months of depositions and discovery and legal maneuvering. 3 months of watching Pemberton continue to patrol the streets of Millbrook, continue to harass homeless people, continue to do exactly what he'd always done, while lawyers argued about procedures and technicalities. But things were changing beneath the surface. FBI agents appeared in Millbrook, not loudly, not with sirens and press conferences, but quietly, asking questions, reviewing records, building timelines that connected Jerome's arrest to 49 others, each one a brick in the wall of evidence against a department that had turned civil rights violations into standard operating procedure. Captain Shepard took medical leave. Personal reasons, the press release said. Stress-related. Nobody believed it. Officer Pemberton was reassigned to administrative duties. Desk work while the investigation proceeded. His union filed a grievance. The grievance was pending. Sergeant Niles, the booking officer who'd processed Jerome's paperwork, suddenly became very helpful to federal investigators. Whether that helpfulness was genuine cooperation or calculated self-preservation remained to be seen. And Officer Quinlan, the young black officer who'd played good cop while feeding information to Shepard, requested a transfer to another district. The request was approved. He disappeared into the eastern part of the county, where property crimes and domestic disputes kept him busy and far from the spotlight. Jerome watched it all from a distance. Pastor Wade's church had become his base of operations, a room to sleep in, meals in the soup kitchen, access to the church's computer for research and communication. Not charity, Pastor Wade made that clear, but mutual aid. Jerome helped where he could. Maintenance, cooking, counseling other veterans who came through the program, men and women who saw themselves in his story and needed to know there was someone who understood. The VA benefits finally came through. 4 months after Jerome's arrest, 16 months after his initial application, a check arrived at the P.O. Box service that served as his mailing address. Back pay, disability compensation, enough money to rent an apartment, to rebuild the foundation of a normal life. He didn't spend it immediately. The money felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had existed before the streets, before the shelters, before the benches and the cold nights and the slow erosion of everything that had made him feel human. But he kept it, saved it, prepared for whatever came next. The hearing was held in the Millbrook City Council chambers, converted courtroom for the day, folding tables arranged in a U-shape, microphones and recorders and legal pads everywhere. The public gallery filled with reporters, activists, concerned citizens who had finally started paying attention. Jerome wore a suit, dark gray, borrowed from the church's clothing closet, altered by a retired tailor who volunteered on Wednesdays. The fit wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to look like someone who belonged in this room, someone who deserved to be heard. He sat at the complainant's table with a lawyer. JAG Corps had recommended her, pro bono representation for a case that had implications far beyond one man's arrest. Her name was Foster, early 40s, sharp eyes, sharper tongue. Across the room, Pemberton sat with his union lawyer. Shepard was absent, still on medical leave, representation provided by the city attorney. Niles was present, seated near the back, expression carefully blank. And at the front of the room, presiding over everything, sat the hearing officer, retired judge from Nashville, appointed by the state attorney general to ensure independence from local politics. This hearing is called to order. The gavel fell, the room quieted, and then a door at the back opened. Jerome turned, saw a man in uniform enter the chamber, navy dress whites, commander's insignia, walking with the controlled precision of someone trained to project authority without demanding it. Lattimore had arrived. Their eyes met across the room. 2 brothers, 2 veterans, one in a borrowed suit, one in the uniform that represented everything Jerome had lost. For a moment, the hearing faded into background noise. There was only the recognition between them, the history, the blood. Darius nodded once, then took a seat in the gallery. The hearing officer cleared his throat. We'll begin with opening statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Foster laid it out piece by piece. The body cam footage that Pemberton had logged as malfunctioning, recovered from the city's automatic cloud backup system. The internal memo detailing Operation Clean Sweep and its quotas for transient contacts. The pattern documentation showing 51 arrests on charges that were systematically dropped within 72 hours. Jerome's service record was read into the record. Staff Sergeant Jerome Lattimore, United States Marine Corps, enlisted June 2001, deployed to Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2004 and 2006. Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Purple Heart. Honorable discharge in 2019 following medical evaluation for traumatic brain injury sustained in an IED attack. The room went quiet. Pemberton's lawyer tried to object. Relevance, he argued. The complainant's military record had nothing to do with the charges at issue. The hearing officer overruled him. This hearing is about whether Mr. Lattimore's civil rights were violated by members of this police department. His identity, his complete identity, is absolutely relevant to that question. Foster continued. The complainant's VA benefits claim was placed on administrative hold 4 months after submission. We've traced that hold to a flag placed by an employee of the Memphis Regional Office, an employee who, coincidentally, is married to a Millbrook City Council member. That employee has been suspended pending investigation. The benefits were released only after federal intervention. The room stirred. Reporters scribbled notes. Council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In other words, Foster said, Mr. Lattimore wasn't just arrested without cause. He was systematically denied the support he had earned through military service, apparently in coordination with local officials who wanted him, and others like him, to remain invisible, vulnerable, and easy to remove from public spaces. Darius testified. He walked to the witness stand with the bearing of someone who had briefed generals, who had stood in rooms where decisions affected thousands of lives. The hearing officer swore him in. Commander Lattimore, please state your relationship to the complainant. Jerome Lattimore is my brother, my older brother. And you contacted military legal authorities after his arrest? I did. I contacted NCIS Legal Services, who coordinated with the Department of Defense Inspector General, DODIG, then contacted FBI Civil Rights Division regarding potential pattern of civil rights violations affecting military veterans. Pemberton's lawyer objected. Hearsay, speculation. Overruled. Darius continued, his voice steady and precise. My brother served 2 combat tours in Iraq. He was awarded the Bronze Star for pulling 2 wounded Marines from a burning Humvee while under enemy fire. He sustained a traumatic brain injury from an IED that ended his career. Darius paused, looked directly at Pemberton. And when he came home expecting the country he served to honor its promises, he was abandoned by the VA and criminalized by this police department for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. Pemberton looked away. The actions documented in this case aren't isolated, Darius said. They represent a pattern, a deliberate, systematic effort to remove homeless veterans from visibility, to make them disappear, to treat the people who fought for this country as problems to be cleared rather than citizens to be served. His voice hardened. That pattern will end. The Department of Defense is watching. The FBI is watching. The entire country is watching now, and there will be accountability. The hearing officer delivered preliminary findings at 4:47 p.m. Based on evidence presented, this panel finds probable cause to proceed with disciplinary action against Officer Brock Pemberton for violation of departmental policy, potential violation of Tennessee criminal procedure statutes, and potential violation of federal civil rights law. Officer Pemberton is suspended without pay pending completion of these proceedings. Decertification referral to Tennessee Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission is recommended. Pemberton's face went white. Regarding Sergeant Victor Niles, evidence suggests systemic failures in supervisory review. Administrative leave pending further investigation. Niles stared straight ahead, showed nothing. Regarding Captain Lorraine Shepard, evidence of policy directives that may have facilitated pattern of civil rights violations. Reassignment from command pending completion of investigation. Not termination, not prosecution, just reassignment. The system protected its own. Even when the system was finally forced to acknowledge wrongdoing, it found ways to cushion the fall. Shepard would keep her pension. Pemberton would fight the decertification for years. Niles would retire quietly and never answer for anything. But it was something. It was more than 50 other people had gotten, more than the countless homeless men and women who had been swept away without witnesses, without recordings, without brothers who commanded SEAL teams. Jerome sat in the hearing room after everyone else had left. The chairs were empty. The microphones were off. The cameras had stopped recording. Foster gathered her papers. "This isn't the end," she said. "Civil suits will follow. Maybe criminal charges if the DA has the courage. The consent decree negotiations will take months. There's a lot more fight ahead." "I know." "You did good, Mr. Lattimore. Testifying, staying calm, not letting them bait you." She paused. "Not everyone could have done what you did." Jerome looked at his hands, the same hands that had pulled men from burning vehicles, the same hands that had written pages and pages of documentation in a notebook nobody thought would matter. "I've done harder things." Foster nodded, clicked her briefcase shut, left him alone in the room. Darius found him sitting on the bench. Founders Square Park, 6:23 p.m. The same bench where it had all started. The same sign listing the park hours. The same lamppost that had witnessed Jerome's arrest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire. "Thought I'd find you here." Darius sat down beside him. The dress whites looked out of place in the fading light, too bright, too formal for a public park in Tennessee. Seemed appropriate. "You okay?" Jerome considered the question, considered all the things that weren't okay. The months on the streets, the system that had failed him, the knowledge that other people were still out there, still invisible, still waiting for someone to notice them. "I'm getting there. VA benefits came through, I heard. 4 months ago. You didn't spend them? Wasn't ready." Darius nodded. He understood readiness, understood that some things couldn't be rushed, couldn't be forced, had to come in their own time. "What are you going to do now?" Jerome looked at the park, the benches, the pathways, the places where people like him had been cleared away to make room for tourists and festivals, and the convenient fiction that homelessness was a problem that could be solved by making it invisible. "I'm going to keep documenting," he said. "Keep watching. Keep building cases. Rowan told me the FBI is looking at other cities with similar patterns, similar operations, similar people who fell through the cracks and got swept away. You want to work with them? I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Jerome turned to face his brother. "I know I can't save everyone, can't fix the system, can't undo 16 months of being nobody, but I can be a witness. I can be someone who pays attention when everyone else looks away." Darius was quiet for a long moment. "You know what you sound like?" "What?" "Like the brother I remember, the one who taught me to fight, to survive, to never give up." Darius put a hand on Jerome's shoulder. "I miss that guy. He's been here the whole time, just lost for a while." They sat on the bench as darkness gathered. 2 brothers, 2 veterans, 2 survivors of different wars. One fought overseas, one fought on the streets of the country they'd sworn to protect. The battle wasn't over. The consent decree would take months to negotiate. The policy changes would be announced with fanfare and implemented with reluctance. Shepard would retire quietly. Pemberton would appeal his decertification and probably win on technicalities. The email with the redacted initials, the one authorizing Operation Clean Sweep, would never be publicly attributed. But something had changed. Someone had paid attention. Someone had documented. Someone had refused to disappear. And in the federal database, in the files that Rowan was building, in the growing record of systematic abuse that would eventually force accountability, Jerome Lattimore's name was there. Case number 51. The homeless veteran who made a phone call. The man who refused to be invisible. The fight continued. It always did. 3 weeks later, the Millbrook Gazette published a story. Chief announces retirement. Personal reasons cited. Jerome read it on the library computer. Mrs. Odom had saved Terminal 3 for him, same as always. The article was short, dignified. Chief Bernard Holt, 32 years of service, retiring to spend more time with family. The retirement package included full pension and benefits. Also included, buried in the third paragraph, was a consulting contract with the city's upcoming police reform initiative. The Fox, hired to redesign the henhouse. Jerome closed the browser, opened his notebook, added the date, the headline, the details. The documentation continued. Somewhere in Nashville, SSA, Rowan was preparing recommendations for the consent decree. Somewhere in Washington, DODIG, was investigating the connection between VA holds and local police operations. Somewhere in this very city, people who had done terrible things were sleeping soundly, confident that the system would protect them the way it always had. But somewhere else, in a small room in the basement of First Baptist Church, a man with a notebook was watching, remembering, waiting. The next case was already brewing. Another homeless veteran. Another suspicious arrest. Another pattern that looked familiar. Jerome picked up his phone, the prepaid cell that Pastor Wade had provided. He dialed a number. "Agent Rowan, it's Lattimore. I think we need to talk." "You think one hearing changes anything?" The voice came through the phone like gravel scraping concrete. Pemberton. 3 weeks suspended. 3 weeks of sitting at home while his union lawyer filed appeals and his buddies on the force told him to hang tight. 3 weeks of building rage. Jerome held the phone away from his ear. The call had come to Pastor Wade's church line. Someone had leaked the number, or maybe Pemberton had just worked through the directory until he found it. "Officer Pemberton, this call is being recorded." "Record whatever you want. You think I'm scared? You think some federal hearing is going to end my career?" A bitter laugh. "I've got 20 years in. I've got a union. I've got lawyers. And I've got friends who remember what you people did to this department." You people. Jerome let the words hang. Let the recording capture them. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" Yeah, there is." Pemberton's voice dropped. Quieter now, more dangerous. "I want you to know that this isn't over. Not by a long shot. You got lucky with your Navy brother and your FBI friends. But luck runs out. And when it does, when all these cameras and lawyers and reporters move on to the next story, I'll still be here. And so will you." The line went dead. Jerome set the phone down, looked at the recording app on Pastor Wade's tablet, still running, capturing every word. Evidence. He saved the file, emailed it to Agent Rowan, added it to the growing collection of documentation that would eventually bury Pemberton deeper than any single hearing ever could. Then he picked up his notebook and started writing. The federal investigation had expanded. What started as a single arrest in Founders Square Park had become something larger, something that reached beyond Millbrook, beyond Tennessee, into a network of cities where similar patterns had emerged. Homeless sweeps before major events, arrests on charges that evaporated within 72 hours, VA holds that coincidentally affected veterans in specific geographic areas. SSA. Rowan had been tracking it for 14 months before Jerome's case landed on her desk. Now, with DOD involvement and congressional attention, the resources had multiplied. She met Jerome at a coffee shop on the edge of downtown, neutral territory, away from the precinct, away from the church, away from anywhere their conversation might be overheard. "We've identified similar operations in 6 other cities." Rowan spread photographs across the table, documents, emails, organizational charts. Memphis, Louisville, Birmingham, Charlotte, Jacksonville, and now we're looking at Atlanta. Jerome studied the materials. Names he didn't recognize, cities he'd never visited, but the patterns were identical. Who's coordinating this? That's what we're trying to determine. Rowan tapped a photograph. A memo with multiple signatures, most of them redacted. These operations require funding, require coordination between law enforcement and city administration, require someone with enough authority to make things happen across jurisdictional lines. Politicians. Politicians, business associations, tourism boards, anyone with a financial interest in making visible poverty disappear. Rowan leaned back. The problem is, they're careful. They don't leave obvious trails. Everything is couched in language about public safety and quality of life initiatives, nothing that sounds illegal on its face. But the implementation is illegal. The implementation is where they slip up. Officers like Pemberton don't care about legal niceties. They care about results. And when they produce results through civil rights violations, they create evidence. Jerome picked up one of the photographs, an email dated 6 months before his arrest. Subject line, Downtown Initiative, Funding Confirmation. The sender's name was redacted, but the recipient was clear. Captain Lorraine Shepard. Someone above Shepard authorized this. Someone with enough power to stay anonymous even after federal subpoenas. Rowan gathered the photographs. That's where you come in. Me? You've been documenting homeless experiences in Millbrook for 11 months. You have contacts in that community, people who trust you, who might have seen things, who might know names that haven't appeared in any official investigation. Jerome understood. The FBI could subpoena documents and interview officials, but they couldn't reach the people who lived in the shadows, the homeless population that had been targeted, victimized, and systematically ignored. Those people would talk to Jerome, because Jerome was one of them. The first name came from a woman named Dolores, 63 years old, former schoolteacher, lost her pension in a scam, lost her house to foreclosure, lost her husband to a heart attack 3 months later. She'd been homeless in Millbrook for 2 years, surviving on soup kitchens and the occasional night in shelters when beds were available. Jerome found her at the library, the same library where he'd spent months researching his own case, where Mrs. Odom had protected his access to computers and dignity. Dolores sat in the periodicals section, reading a 3-day-old newspaper, marking job listings she would never be able to apply for because she had no address, no phone, no way to present herself as anything other than what she'd become. Ms. Dolores, Jerome sat in the chair beside her. I'm Jerome Lattimore. Pastor Wade said you might be willing to talk. She looked at him with eyes that had stopped expecting anything good. Talk about what? About what happened to you last summer. The arrest. Her hands tightened on the newspaper. The memory was still raw, still bleeding. Nothing happened. They let me go. They held you for 3 days on a trespassing charge that was dropped without explanation. Then your Social Security card went missing from your possessions, and you spent 4 months trying to get a replacement. Dolores stared at him. The words had landed like stones, each one a weight she'd been carrying alone. How do you know that? Because the same thing happened to 49 other people. The FBI is investigating. But they need witnesses. They need people willing to tell their stories. And then what? They arrest some cop, give him a suspension, and everything goes back to normal? Dolores shook her head. I've seen how this works. The system protects itself. Always has. Always will. Maybe. But I'm not asking you to believe in the system. I'm asking you to help me build a record. Names, dates, what they took, what they said. Everything that happened that nobody else bothered to write down. Dolores was quiet for a long moment. The library hummed around them. Computers clicking, pages turning. The soft murmur of people living their lives in the margins of a world that had forgotten them. There was a man, she said finally. Came to the shelter the night before they arrested me. Said he was from the city. Said they were doing a census of homeless services. Asked all kinds of questions. where we slept, where we got food, how long we'd been on the streets. What did he look like? White, 50s, nice suit. Had a clipboard with the city seal on it. Jerome wrote it down. Did he give a name? Called himself Mr. Howard, but I saw his ID badge when he leaned over. Different name. Started with a K. K. Jerome circled the letter, added it to his list of fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet, but would, eventually, if he kept asking questions. Thank you, Ms. Dolores. Don't thank me yet. She went back to her newspaper. Won't mean anything unless something actually changes. The pattern emerged over weeks of conversations. A man in a suit, calling himself different names, appearing at shelters and soup kitchens in the days before major sweeps, asking questions, taking notes, identifying targets. Jerome collected descriptions, compiled them into a composite. White male, mid-50s, gray hair, professional demeanor, city credentials that never quite checked out. He gave the composite to Rowan. She ran it through databases, cross-referenced with city employment records, contractor lists, political donor registries. The match came back 3 days later. Kenneth Ridley, 54, former city councilman. Lost his seat in 2018 after a corruption scandal that never quite reached prosecution. Now officially employed as a community liaison consultant for the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce. Unofficially, he was the architect. Ridley designed the whole system, Rowan explained, spreading documents across the table at their next meeting. He created the Quality of Life Initiative framework during his time on the council. When he lost his seat, he took the framework private, sold it to other cities as a consulting package. How to clean up your downtown in time for tourist season. And the cities bought it. 7 that we know of. Probably more. He's careful about contracts. Everything is structured through shell companies and non-profit fronts. But the implementation is always the same. Census the homeless population. Identify the most visible. Coordinate with police to sweep them before major events. Make the problem disappear without actually solving it. Jerome stared at the photograph in Ridley's file. Ordinary face. The kind of face you'd see at a city council meeting, a business luncheon, a charity gala. The face of someone who'd learned to dress up cruelty in respectable language. Can you arrest him? For what? Being a consultant? Writing policy recommendations? Nothing he's done is technically illegal. The civil rights violations happen at the implementation level. Police officers making arrests, city officials signing off on operations. Ridley's fingerprints are everywhere, but they're always on the planning documents, never on the execution. So he walks. Unless we can prove direct coordination with the illegal implementation, unless someone with first-hand knowledge testifies that Ridley gave specific orders that resulted in specific violations. Rowan closed the file. We need someone inside. Jerome understood what she was asking. The meeting was arranged through channels that officially didn't exist. Pastor Wade knew someone who had worked with Ridley's nonprofit during the 2019 holiday season. That someone was willing to make an introduction, for the right reasons, not for money, but for the same kind of justice that Jerome had been chasing since his arrest. Her name was Tamara Vance, 31, former social worker. She'd quit the nonprofit after 6 months when she realized what she was actually being asked to do: identify vulnerable individuals for relocation assistance that turned out to be police sweeps. She agreed to meet Jerome at a park in Nashville, neutral ground, 60 miles from Millbrook, far enough from Ridley's network to feel safe. I knew it was wrong. Tamara sat on a bench, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. The way they talked about these people, like they were statistics, like they weren't human beings with lives and histories and families. What exactly did Ridley ask you to do? At first it seemed legitimate. Outreach, connect homeless individuals with services, document their needs. But then the documentation started going to different people, police liaisons, city officials, and the people I documented started disappearing. Disappearing how? Arrested, transported to other counties. Some of them ended up in facilities 200 miles away. voluntary mental health placements that they never agreed to. By the time anyone noticed they were gone, the festival was over and nobody cared anymore. Jerome wrote everything down: dates, names, specific instances that could be corroborated with records. "Did Ridley ever give you direct instructions about the arrests?" Tamara hesitated. The question was dangerous. Answering it meant committing to testimony that could destroy her former employer, and potentially her own career, since she'd participated in the system before understanding what it was. "Once," she said finally, "December 19th, 2022, Christmas festival weekend. Ridley called me personally, told me to flag 5 individuals for immediate intervention. His exact words. I asked what that meant. He said the police would handle it. I didn't flag anyone. Quit 2 weeks later. Can you prove the call happened? I have phone records. And I kept a journal. Everything I saw. Everything that felt wrong. I never thought anyone would actually investigate." Jerome looked at her. A woman who'd tried to do the right thing, gotten caught up in something she didn't understand, and found the courage to walk away, to document, to wait for someone to ask the questions that mattered. "Ms. Vance, the FBI is building a case. They need witnesses. They need someone who can connect Ridley to specific operations, specific instructions, specific outcomes." "I know." Tamara's voice was steady, resolved. "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to ask. The answer is yes. I'll testify." The grand jury convened in Nashville. Federal courthouse, marble floors, American flags flanking the entrance, the machinery of justice grinding into motion, slow and deliberate, the way it always ground when powerful people finally faced accountability. Jerome wasn't allowed inside. Witnesses were sequestered. But he waited in the corridor, watching faces come and go. Lawyers in expensive suits, FBI agents in professional anonymity, officials from cities across the Southeast who had suddenly become very interested in cooperation. Tamara testified for 4 hours. Dolores testified for 2. 7 other homeless individuals from Millbrook and surrounding cities testified about arrests, detentions, voluntary relocations that were anything but voluntary. Their voices filled the record, voices that had been silenced for years, finally given space to speak. And at the end of the 3rd day, Kenneth Ridley was indicted. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. 15 counts that could put him away for decades, if the prosecution could make them stick. Jerome watched the news coverage from the church basement. Pastor Wade sat beside him, silent, watching the face of the man who had designed the system that had targeted them both. "They'll offer him a deal," Wade said. "Men like that always get deals. Cooperate against the politicians, give up the money trail, walk away with a slap on the wrist." "Maybe. You don't sound disappointed." Jerome considered the question, considered everything he'd seen over the past months, the slow grind of investigation, the compromises and calculations, the way justice always seemed to stop short of the people who really deserved it. "I learned a long time ago that you fight the battles you can win," he said. "Ridley's indictment means the system is exposed, means other cities will think twice before hiring consultants to sweep their homeless populations, means the next time someone like Pemberton arrests someone like me, there's a record, a pattern, something that can't be ignored. That's not justice. No, but it's progress, and sometimes progress is all you get." The consent decree was signed 4 months later. City of Millbrook, Department of Justice, 18 pages of requirements and oversight mechanisms and promises that would be tested over years of implementation. Civilian Review Board with real authority. Body camera mandates with real consequences. Bias training that actually addressed bias instead of checking boxes. An independent monitor appointed to evaluate compliance quarterly. The press conference was held in the city council chambers. Mayor, chief of police, new one, hired from outside after Holt's retirement, DOJ representatives, everyone smiling, everyone shaking hands, everyone pretending that change had arrived, that the system had reformed itself, that the future would be different from the past. Jerome watched from the back of the room. He'd been invited, symbolically, as the face of the case that had started everything. But he hadn't been asked to speak, hadn't been consulted on the decree's provisions, hadn't been treated as anything other than a prop for a political moment. That was fine. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here to document, to remember, to make sure that the promises made in this room were held against the reality of what happened on the streets. After the ceremony, Agent Rowan found him near the exit. Heading out? Nothing left to see here. There's something you should know. Rowan's voice dropped. Pemberton's decertification was denied. Insufficient evidence, the commission said. He'll be reinstated next month. Jerome absorbed the information. Let it settle into the place where disappointments lived, alongside all the other failures of a system that protected its own. What about Shepard? Retired. Full pension. Consulting contract was canceled after the indictment, but she's already landed another job, private security firm in Atlanta. And Niles? Same. Retired quietly, moved to Florida. Nobody's looking for him. The names of the people who had victimized him, who had participated in a system designed to make vulnerable people disappear. Walking free, living comfortable lives, facing no consequences except the minor inconvenience of changing jobs. What about Ridley? Trial's scheduled for next spring. He's fighting every charge. His lawyers are good. It'll be a long process. Jerome nodded, looked around the room one last time, the politicians and officials and reporters all congratulating themselves on a problem solved. I should go. Lattimore, Rowan's voice stopped him at the door. What you did mattered. The documentation, the witnesses, building a case that couldn't be ignored. None of this would have happened without you. It would have happened eventually. Maybe, but eventually wasn't good enough for the people who were suffering now. You made eventually into today. That's not nothing. Jerome didn't respond, just walked out into the afternoon sun, where the real world waited with all its unfinished business. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, kitchen with appliances that worked most of the time, bathroom with a door that closed, windows that looked out on a street where people walked their dogs and pushed their strollers and lived their normal lives. Jerome had signed the lease 3 months ago, first place of his own in almost 2 years, paid for with back via benefits and disability compensation that had finally started flowing the way it was supposed to. The walls were bare. The furniture was minimal: bed, table, 2 chairs. The only decoration was a photograph on the nightstand. Jerome and Darius, 20 years younger, standing in front of their childhood home in Baltimore. 2 brothers who had no idea what waited for them in the years ahead. He sat at the table with his notebook open, navy blue cover, worn at the edges, pages filled with dates and names and observations. The documentation continued. Even now, even after the hearing, the indictment, the consent decree. Because Jerome had learned that justice wasn't a destination, it was a process, an ongoing effort that required constant attention, constant vigilance, constant willingness to see what others preferred to ignore. His phone buzzed. Message from Rowan. New case. Louisville. Similar pattern. Need your eyes on something. Call me. Jerome stared at the message. Louisville. Another city. Another system designed to make vulnerable people invisible. Another battle that someone would have to fight. He thought about the apartment, the stability, the quiet life that was finally within reach. Then he picked up the phone and called. Louisville was colder than Millbrook, January wind cutting through the downtown streets, carrying snow that felt like needles against exposed skin. Jerome walked the blocks around the homeless shelter on 4th Street, watching patterns, noting faces, doing what he'd learned to do best. Document. Observe. Remember. The shelter director was a woman named Patterson, 50s, tired eyes, the expression of someone who'd seen too much and kept going anyway because the alternative was giving up. We've lost 60 people since October, she said, leading Jerome through corridors lined with cots and sleeping bags. Not lost like dead, lost like disappeared. Here one day, gone the next. No forwarding address, no contact with family, just gone. Where do they go? That's what I've been trying to figure out. Some of them turn up in other cities, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus. Some of them don't turn up at all. Police involvement? 3 arrests that I know of. Trespassing charges, same as always. But the arrests don't explain the others. The ones who just vanish. Jerome wrote it down. The pattern was familiar. Too familiar. The same playbook he'd seen in Millbrook, adapted for a different city with different names. Who's running the operation here? Patterson hesitated. The question touched something she wasn't sure she wanted to reveal. There's a man. Comes around sometimes. Suits. City credentials. Asks questions about our residents. Says he's doing outreach coordination. What does he look like? 50s, gray hair, professional. Calls himself different names depending on the day. Jerome's pen stopped moving. Ridley. What? His name is Kenneth Ridley. He's under federal indictment in Tennessee for conspiracy to violate civil rights. And if he's operating here, the FBI needs to know immediately. Patterson's face changed. The weariness was still there, but something else emerged. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. The recognition that she wasn't alone in what she'd been seeing. You can prove this? I've spent 11 months proving it, and I'm going to keep proving it until there's nowhere left for men like Ridley to hide. The Louisville investigation took 6 weeks. Jerome worked alongside Rowan's team, doing what he'd done in Millbrook, building trust with homeless communities, collecting testimonies, documenting patterns that police reports would never capture. The operation was larger than Tennessee, more sophisticated. Ridley had been busy during his time awaiting trial, expanding his network, training local contacts, spreading the system to cities that were willing to pay for the service of making their problems disappear. But the system had a weakness. It depended on invisibility, on no one paying attention, on the assumption that homeless people didn't matter, didn't have voices, didn't have advocates willing to fight for them. That assumption was wrong. By March, the Louisville investigation had generated enough evidence for a superseding indictment. Ridley's charges expanded. His co-conspirators were named: city officials, police liaisons, business association executives. The network that had seemed untouchable was coming apart, one documented violation at a time. Jerome watched the arrest from across the street. Ridley in handcuffs, led out of his hotel room by federal agents, looking smaller than he had in photographs. Looking like what he was, a man who'd built a career on dehumanizing people who couldn't fight back, finally facing the consequences. It wasn't complete justice. The system that had created Ridley was still intact. The conditions that made his work possible, homelessness, poverty, municipal indifference, hadn't changed. Tomorrow, someone else would design another framework. Another consultant would sell another solution that involved sweeping problems out of sight instead of actually solving them. But today, one architect of suffering was off the streets. Today was enough. The reunion happened in Baltimore, Jerome's hometown, the place where he'd grown up, where he'd enlisted, where he'd said goodbye to family before deploying to wars that would change him in ways he couldn't have imagined. Darius had arranged it. A weekend gathering at their mother's house, the same house in the photograph on Jerome's nightstand, older now, but still standing, still home in the way that mattered. Their mother, Eleanor, was 72, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. She'd raised 2 boys alone after their father died, worked double shifts to keep them fed and clothed, pushed them toward the military because it was a path out of poverty and she couldn't see another one. She hugged Jerome at the door, held on longer than usual, said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The house smelled like Sunday dinner, roast chicken, collard greens, cornbread cooling on the counter, the sounds and smells of a childhood that felt impossibly distant, separated by decades and deployments and everything that had happened since. Darius arrived in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater, looking almost normal, almost like the kid brother Jerome remembered instead of the commander he'd become. They sat on the porch after dinner. Same porch where they'd sat 1,000 times before. Same view of the street, the neighbors' houses, the world they'd grown up in. "You look better," Darius said. "Feel better." Louisville was rough. Louisville was necessary. Jerome watched a car pass, kids playing basketball in a driveway across the street. Normal life, continuing. Ridley's trial starts next month. Prosecution thinks they can get 30 years. Will it stick? Maybe. His lawyers are good, but the evidence is overwhelming. Tamara's testimony, the documents, everything. Darius was quiet for a moment. The silence between them was comfortable. The silence of brothers who'd known each other too long to need constant conversation. "What's next for you?" Jerome considered the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for weeks. Months. Since the moment he'd walked out of the Millbrook precinct and realized that his life was no longer defined by survival. "Rowan wants me to consult, officially. Work with FBI civil rights on cases involving homeless populations." "That's big. That's bureaucracy, paperwork, meetings, everything I spent 20 years avoiding. But it's work that matters, work that uses what I learned, what I am." Jerome looked at his brother. "I spent 11 months on the streets, watched people get swept away like trash, watched systems designed to help people get weaponized against them. If I can do something about that, something more than just documenting, then maybe everything I went through wasn't just suffering. Maybe it was preparation." Darius nodded. "You sound like you've already decided." "I think I have." "Then do it. Take the job. Fight the fights that need fighting." Darius paused. "Just don't disappear again. Okay? Call Mom. Call me. Let us know you're alive." "I will." "Promise?" Jerome looked at his brother, the SEAL commander, the man who'd mobilized federal resources with a single phone call, the kid brother who'd followed him into the military and become something more than Jerome had ever imagined. "I promise." The trial lasted 7 weeks. United States of America versus Kenneth Ridley, et al., Federal Courthouse in Nashville. The same courthouse where the grand jury had convened, where the indictment had been handed down, where the machinery of justice had slowly ground its way toward this moment. Jerome attended every day. He sat in the gallery, watching testimony unfold, watching the prosecution build its case piece by piece. Tamara on the stand, describing her 6 months inside Ridley's organization. Dolores describing her arrest, her detention, the missing Social Security card that had derailed her life for months. Other witnesses, homeless individuals from 7 cities, all telling variations of the same story, the same system, the same cruelty dressed up in bureaucratic language. Ridley's defense was creative, plausible deniability. He was just a consultant. He offered recommendations. What local officials did with those recommendations was beyond his control. The jury didn't buy it. Guilty on 12 of 15 counts. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. The charges that carried the most weight, the ones that would put him away for decades. Ridley showed no emotion when the verdict was read. His lawyers immediately announced plans to appeal. The process would continue for years, motion after motion, argument after argument, but for now, he was going to prison. For now, that was enough. Jerome stood outside the courthouse after the verdict. Late afternoon sun slanting through downtown Nashville. Traffic noise. People walking past, most of them unaware that history had just been made inside the building behind him. Rowan found him there. "Congratulations. Save it for someone who deserves it. Tamara, Dolores, the investigators who did the actual work. They deserve it too, but so do you." Rowan stood beside him, watching the city move. "None of this happens without your documentation, your witnesses, your willingness to keep fighting when everyone else had given up." I didn't give up because I couldn't afford to. People were depending on me. People who had no one else. That's exactly what I mean. Rowan reached into her bag, pulled out a folder. This is your official offer. FBI consultant, Civil Rights Division, Homeless Populations Specialist. Jerome took the folder, didn't open it. I thought about it. And? And I have conditions. Rowan's eyebrows rose. Conditions for a federal job? That's bold. I want access, not just to cases that come across your desk, but to the ones that get buried, the ones that nobody thinks are worth investigating, the patterns that don't show up in official statistics. That's complicated. Everything worth doing is complicated. You want me to work for you? You give me the tools to actually make a difference. Otherwise, I'm more useful on my own. Rowan studied him, the man who'd survived 11 months on the streets, the man who'd built a case that brought down a conspiracy spanning 7 states, the man who'd learned to see what others refused to see. I'll make some calls. Do that. Jerome opened the folder, scanned the pages. Job description, compensation, benefits that he hadn't had access to in years, the structure of a normal life, offered on government letterhead. He signed the last page, handed the folder back. Welcome to the Bureau. Rowan smiled. God help us all. The work began immediately. Cases piled on Jerome's desk, reports from field offices across the country, flagged for his attention. Homeless populations experiencing unusual police activity. Sweeps before major events, patterns that looked familiar because they were familiar. He traveled. Cincinnati, Phoenix, Portland, Seattle, cities where the same playbook was being implemented, the same cruelty was being normalized, the same people were being treated as problems to be cleared instead of citizens to be served. Each city was different. Each city was the same. In Portland, he met a veteran named Marcus, 61, Marine Corps, Vietnam, living under a bridge for 3 years while his VA claim languished in bureaucratic limbo. Jerome connected him with advocates who knew how to navigate the system, who could accelerate what should never have been delayed. In Phoenix, he documented a sweep that had displaced 200 people 3 days before the Super Bowl, coordinated with local activists to file civil rights complaints, watched as the city scrambled to respond to scrutiny they hadn't expected. In Seattle, he testified at a city council hearing about patterns he'd observed, named names, cited documentation, watched council members squirm as evidence accumulated that their policies were designed to hide problems rather than solve them. The work was exhausting. The progress was slow. The victories were incomplete. But the documentation continued. Darius called every Sunday. The same time, the same day, the same ritual of connection that their mother had insisted on when they were children. Wherever Jerome was, whatever case he was working, he made time for the call. How's the job? Brutal, but worth it. Mom says you're too thin. Mom says everyone's too thin. She's not wrong. Darius paused. The pause that meant something important was coming. I've been thinking about after. After what? After my career. After the Navy. After I'm not a commander anymore. Jerome leaned back in his chair. Hotel room in Denver, another city, another case. You're thinking about retirement? Thinking about options. 20 years in. Could walk away with full benefits. Do something else. Like what? Like what you're doing. Working with veterans. Making sure people don't fall through the cracks the way you did. Jerome was quiet for a long moment. His brother, the decorated SEAL commander, the man who'd mobilized federal resources with a phone call, talking about following Jerome's path instead of the other way around. That's not a small decision. Nothing worth doing is small. Darius's voice was thoughtful, measured. You showed me something. That fighting doesn't end when you take off the uniform. That the skills we learned, Observation, documentation, persistence. They work in civilian life too. They can make a difference. The difference is smaller, slower, less satisfying. But it's real. Yeah. Jerome looked out the window at the Denver skyline. Mountains in the distance. A world that kept moving regardless of what happened in its shadows. It's real. The Pemberton situation resolved 6 months later. Not through the legal system, not through official channels, through the accumulated weight of documentation that made it impossible for even his union to protect him anymore. 3 more complaints had been filed after his reinstatement. All documented, all photographed, all recorded on cell phones by people who had learned that documentation was power. The 3rd complaint involved a homeless veteran named Samuel Washington. Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan. PTSD that the VA had been treating for years. Pemberton had arrested him for loitering outside a coffee shop. The arrest had been recorded by 4 different witnesses. The recording showed Pemberton using force that exceeded any reasonable interpretation of departmental policy. Samuel's attorney was ex-JAG Corps, connected to the same network that had helped Jerome 2 years earlier. The civil suit was filed within weeks. The city settled within months, $200,000, plus an agreement that Pemberton's employment would be reviewed by an independent panel. The review took 60 days. The finding was unanimous. Unfit for duty. Decertification recommended. This time, the recommendation was accepted. Jerome learned about it from Rowan, who had kept track of the case as a matter of professional interest. He's done. Can't work in law enforcement anywhere in Tennessee. Probably anywhere in the country. What about criminal charges? DA's looking at it. Samuel's attorney is pushing. But you know how these things go. Jerome knew. The system protected itself. Even when individual officers were removed, the system that had created them remained intact, ready to produce more Pembertons, more Shepherds, more operations designed to sweep problems out of sight. But one fewer predator with a badge was still one fewer predator. Progress. Slow. Incomplete. But real. Pastor Wade died on a Tuesday, 70 years old. Heart attack. Quick, according to the doctors. No suffering. One moment he was preparing for evening services, the next moment he was gone. Jerome got the call while he was in Atlanta, working a case involving homeless encampment clearances near the new stadium development. He drove through the night to get back to Millbrook. The funeral was held at First Baptist, the same church where Jerome had found shelter when he had nothing, the same basement where he'd eaten meals alongside other people with nowhere else to go. The pews were full. Community members, church families, homeless individuals who had been transformed by Wade's compassion. They came in suits and in street clothes, in ties and in worn jackets, all of them present to say goodbye to a man who had treated everyone the same, regardless of circumstance. Jerome sat in the front row. Beside him, Darius in civilian clothes. Behind them, their mother Eleanor, who had driven down from Baltimore because she remembered meeting Wade once, remembered the way he'd talked about her son, remembered thinking that anyone who saw that much good in Jerome was worth knowing. The service lasted 2 hours. Stories, songs, memories shared by people who had been touched by Wade's ministry. Jerome didn't speak, didn't trust his voice to hold. But afterward, standing by the grave in the church cemetery, he made a decision. The Cornelius Wade Foundation launched 6 months later, nonprofit organization dedicated to serving homeless veterans, transitional housing, job training, benefits navigation, all the things that had been missing when Jerome needed them, now available to others because someone had decided they mattered. Jerome funded it with his federal salary and with donations from people who had heard his story. Darius contributed half his savings. Their mother organized fundraising drives in Baltimore that surprised everyone with their success. The foundation's headquarters were in Millbrook, in the basement of First Baptist Church, in the same space where Wade had fed thousands of hungry people over 15 years. The first resident was a veteran named Michelle, Army, medical discharge. Lost her housing when her benefits were delayed for 19 months. Jerome handed her the key to her transitional apartment. "Welcome home." "I can't," her voice broke. "I can't believe someone actually—" "Believe it, and when you're back on your feet, we'll help someone else. That's how this works. We help each other, because nobody else will." Michelle took the key, held it like it was precious, which it was. The key to a door that locked. The key to safety. The key to a future that had seemed impossible until someone decided to make it possible. Jerome watched her walk toward the apartment building. Another veteran saved. Another person who wouldn't fall through the cracks, one at a time. That was how you changed the world. Not with grand gestures or dramatic victories, but with individual acts of compassion repeated until they became a pattern of their own. The final hearing in Ridley's case was held 3 years after his conviction, Supreme Court appeal. Last chance to overturn the verdict, to escape the 23-year sentence that had been handed down. Jerome attended. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to see it end. The arguments lasted 2 hours. Ridley's lawyers made technical claims about jurisdiction and evidence handling. The prosecution responded with precedent and documentation. The justices asked questions, made notes, retreated to chambers. The decision came 4 months later. Appeal denied, conviction upheld. Kenneth Ridley would serve his sentence in federal prison, where he would have plenty of time to contemplate the system he had built and the people he had harmed. Jerome read the decision on his phone, sitting on a bench in Founders Square Park, the same bench where everything had started, the same spot where Pemberton had demanded that he move, where handcuffs had clicked shut, where a man's freedom had evaporated for the crime of being visible. The park looked the same, the benches, the fountain, the sign listing hours and prohibitions. But something had changed. Or maybe Jerome had changed. Maybe the park was just a park now, just a place where people sat and walked and lived their lives. Maybe the trauma had faded enough that he could see it without seeing everything that had happened here. Or maybe not. Maybe some wounds never fully healed. Maybe the best you could do was learn to carry them, to let them inform your work instead of defining your life. His phone buzzed. Message from the Foundation. New resident arriving today. Vietnam vet, 73. Homeless for 4 years. Ready when you are. Jerome stood up from the bench, stretched muscles that were older than they used to be, that had carried him through wars and streets and courtrooms. Another veteran who needed help. Another person who had been forgotten by systems that should have served them. The work continued. It always would. Eleanor Lattimore passed away on a spring morning, 2 years after Pastor Wade. 74 years old. Peaceful, surrounded by her sons in the Baltimore house where she had raised them, where she had worked double shifts, where she had pushed them toward futures that seemed impossible. Jerome held her hand at the end. Darius held the other. She didn't say much, didn't need to. The life she had lived was its own statement. The sons she had raised were its own legacy. After the funeral, Jerome and Darius sat on the porch of the family home. The same porch where they had sat 100 times before. The same view, the same neighborhood, the same world that had shaped them. She would be proud, Darius said. She was proud. Told me every time we talked. Me too. Darius was quiet for a moment. I put in my papers. Retirement? End of the year. 22 years. Time to do something else. Jerome looked at his brother, the commander who had never stopped being the kid brother, the man who had mobilized federal resources with a phone call and decided to follow a different path. The Foundation could use you. That's what I was thinking. It's not glamorous work. Neither is anything worth doing. Jerome smiled, the first real smile in days. You sound like Mom. I sound like you. Darius put a hand on Jerome's shoulder. Thank you. For what? For showing me what fighting actually looks like. Not the uniforms and the missions and the medals. The real fighting. The kind that happens after you take off the uniform, when nobody's watching, when the only reward is knowing you made a difference. Jerome didn't have words, didn't need them. They sat on the porch as the sun set. Two brothers, two veterans, two men who had learned that the battles that mattered most were the ones nobody saw, the ones that continued long after the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines faded and the world moved on. The work continued. 10 years later, the Cornelius Wade Foundation operated in 12 cities, had served 14,000 veterans, had become a model for homeless services nationwide, studied and replicated and cited in congressional testimony about what was possible when someone decided to actually solve problems instead of just managing them. Jerome was 64 now, gray hair, slower movements, but the same sharp eyes, the same instinct for documentation, the same unwillingness to accept systems that treated people as problems to be cleared. He sat in his office at the Foundation headquarters, same building, same basement, same space where Wade had fed thousands of hungry people and where Jerome had found shelter when he had nothing. On his desk, photographs, Wade's service, his mother's funeral, Darius at his retirement ceremony, the veterans they had helped over the years, faces that represented individual victories in an endless war against indifference, and one other photograph, Jerome on a bench, Founders Square Park, 5:47 a.m. The image captured from Pastor Wade's phone, the video that had started everything. He looked at it sometimes, reminded himself where he'd been, where he'd come from, what he'd survived. The phone rang. "Mr. Lattimore, this is Agent Chen, FBI Civil Rights. We've got a new case, pattern we haven't seen before. Could use your eyes on it." Jerome picked up his notebook. Navy blue cover, fifth one since the original. Pages filled with dates and names and observations. "Tell me what you've got." The bench in Founders Square Park was still there. Jerome visited sometimes, not often, just when he needed to remember, when the weight of the work threatened to become crushing, when progress seemed impossible, when the system seemed designed to resist every attempt at change. He sat on the bench and watched the city move around him, people walking dogs, parents pushing strollers, joggers and commuters and tourists photographing the fountain. Normal life. Continuing. Oblivious to the battles being fought in its margins. The sign was still there too. Founders Square Park. Hours. 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. No camping. No overnight sleeping. The rules hadn't changed, but the enforcement had. The consent decree. The civilian review board. The documentation that made it impossible to sweep people away without consequences. Progress. Slow. Incomplete. But real. A young man sat down on the other end of the bench, early 20s, worn clothes, backpack that contained everything he owned, the look in his eyes that Jerome recognized, the look of someone who had run out of options, who had nowhere else to go. "You okay?" Jerome asked. The young man looked at him, suspicious, guarded, the way you learned to be when you lived on the streets, when trust was a luxury you couldn't afford. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "Look, I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just sitting here. The park is open." Jerome nodded, reached into his pocket, pulled out a card. "I know the park is open. I also know that sitting here doesn't solve whatever problem brought you here." He handed over the card. "Cornelius Wade Foundation. We help veterans. You serve?" The young man looked at the card, then at Jerome. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or hope. The beginning of trust. "Army. 2 years. Medical discharge." "VA treating you okay?" "VA doesn't know I exist." Jerome smiled. The same smile he'd given 1,000 times before, to 1,000 other veterans who'd fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to catch them. "Then let's fix that. Come with me." He stood up from the bench, extended his hand. The young man hesitated. Years of disappointment weighing against this moment, this stranger, this offer of help that seemed too good to be real. Then he took Jerome's hand, and they walked out of the park together.
Thank Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.